Greetings from Mesa United Methodist Church of Albuquerque, New Mexico. We hope this message will be meaningful and relevant to your life and your relationship with God. We are located at the corner of Taylor Ranch and Montana Road, and we invite you to join us for worship every Sunday. Our traditional service is at 8:30 a.m., and our contemporary worship is at 11 a.m. More information may be found at our website, mesaviewumc.com. To honor all copyright restrictions, we have removed some audio and video footage from this message. Now may you be blessed through the reading and hearing of God's holy word. And in the contemporary service, we actually read the scripture reading together. So our gospel reading this morning comes to us from the gospel according to Mark, from the 10th chapter, so let us read together. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to Jesus and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or my left hand is not mine to grant, but is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those who they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." This is the good news of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Thanks be to God. Today we conclude our Christmas in July worship series, looking at what many people consider to be the greatest Christmas movie of all time, It's a Wonderful Life. Now, of the other movies that we've covered so far, even though we were talking about faith and what they could teach us about our faith lives, none of them were actually about faith or religion or God. None of them actually even mentioned God, even though they're Christmas movies. But It's a Wonderful Life is different because it does involve all three of these things. There are integral parts of the story. And it's also the darkest of all the Christmas movies which we have seen. It's a Wonderful Life was directed by the wonderful Frank Capra, released in December of 1946, to only tepid reviews and performance. It actually lost money. Although it was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, the only award it won was for a technical one in a new way of creating snow on a stage, which they actually did in what was then one of the hottest summers that California had ever experienced. The release of this movie was pushed up from 1947 in order to compete for Academy Awards in 1946, but it was widely trounced by The Best Years of Our Lives, which went on to win 9 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. And since now Hollywood is really concerned with doing remakes of movies rather than creating anything new, if any of you know big-time Hollywood producers, in their Best Years of Our Life is one that might be remade now to tell stories of soldiers coming back from war and not being able to readjust into society because of physical and mental injuries. That certainly is a problem of our own time that was speaking to in the post-World War II years as well. But anyways, as the movie begins, we hear a series of prayers that are being lifted up on behalf of George Bailey, played so well by Jimmy Stewart. It was his first role after he came back from serving in the Army in World War II. And George is in trouble. And so the town in which he lives are lifting up prayers to God to help him in his time of need. And we see this prayer then being received by a few angels in heaven who call Clarence Oddbody, who is an angel second class, that is, he's not yet earned his wings, to go and help George. And we'll come back to the idea of angels in a little bit. But once Clarence is introduced to the story, he is then begin to be shown a little bit of the backstory of George and something about his life. So we learn some important things in that backstory. The first is that George is willing to risk not only his happiness, but his own life in trying to save his brother in order to help other people. Even when his father is too busy to be able to help him in his moral dilemma, what do I do with these pills, knowing what Mr. Gower has done, he ends up making the right decision. And he also defends his father against Mr. Potter, the richest man in the county. Not an easy thing to do. And Mr. Potter is played so malevolently by Lionel Barrymore. But his wealth, as you see there, leaves him only greedy and angry and isolated from everyone else in the town. We're also introduced to Violet, who when she grows up is the one who turns everyone's head as she walks down the street, and Mary, who is sitting at the counter there, who George will eventually get married to. And we're also shown that George desires to grow up and kick the dirt of this dusty old town that he lives in, Bedford Falls, in order to go off and see the world, only then come back and to build airstrips and buildings 100 stories tall and bridges a mile long. And yet none of that happens because life's obligations keep coming back to George. And so just at the time he's finally saved up enough money that he can travel the world, his father dies of a stroke. And he stays in town in order to keep things going in the building and loan that his family runs. And then he's ready to go off to college. And the board of directors pushes back an attempt by Mr. Potter to buy the building and loan, but they agree to do so only if George stays and runs it. And so he takes the money he saved up for college and gives it to his younger brother, Harry. So Harry can go to school, with the agreement that once Harry is done, then George will go off to school and Harry will run the building and loan. Except that while he's at school, Harry meets a beautiful girl, he gets married, he gets offered a job with his father-in-law's business. And so George stays. And he then marries Mary, played by Donna Reed. And they save up enough money to be able to go on a honeymoon. And just as they're leaving town, they see that there's a run on the bank. And against Mary's request, George gets out of the car to see what's going on. And this scene is really sort of an illustration, not just of George's life, but of the connections that all of us have together. So what George is trying to get them to understand is that they're all tied together. They sink or they float together. This is a picture by Amy Casey, sort of struck me, of how the web that tangles that we don't really even see, but they keep us as one. And so the building and loan builds community. But George doesn't see that part of the dream that he's always had of building things. Instead, it's just something that the building and loan does because it's what they do. It's the right thing to do for Bedford Falls. And then, most of you remember, the absent-minded Uncle Billy goes to the bank to make a deposit. And as he's rubbing in the face of Mr. Potter the fact that Harry has won the Congressional Medal of Honor, he shows them the headline, and giving him the paper, he inadvertently gives him the envelope with a deposit in it of $8,000, about $100,000 in modern money. But absentmindedly, he doesn't remember what happened, and just as that's happening, the bank examiner shows up. And so now it looks like the building and loan is down $8,000, and perhaps one of them is embezzling money from the building and loan. After a mad search fails to turn up the funds, and Potter has not been honest enough to give the money back. Frank Capra said the letters he received the most of any of the films he made was about why does Potter not only not give the money back, but why is he not prosecuted for stealing the money from the building and loan. But George goes to Potter begging him see them through, and rather than agreeing to help him out, he instead issues an arrest warrant for George. And so now finding himself potentially on the wrong end of the law, he's already decided that he'll take responsibility for what was Billy's mistake. And with an insurance policy worth $15,000, he decides that he's worth more dead than he is alive. And so he goes to Martini's, the bar, and he begins drinking, and he begins praying to God, God, show me the way. And nothing happens. And so George goes to the bridge down by the river and decides to jump off and die by suicide. But he's stopped by his guardian angel Clarence, who makes his first appearance on the scene by throwing himself into the water, knowing that George is such a good guy that he'll jump in order to save Clarence. And that's exactly what's happened. And then he engaged in a conversation, and George says to Clarence, I wish I had never been born. And his request is granted. And George then gets a view of what life would be like if he had never been born. The town is no longer called Bedford Falls, it's now Pottersville. And instead of being a respectable community, it's now filled with gambling halls and bars and, shall we say, dancing girls. Mr. Gower has served 20 years in prison for poisoning a little boy because George wasn't there to stop him. And Harry drowned as a 9-year-old, and so he was not there in order to save the transport full of soldiers that wins him the Congressional Medal of Honor. Instead, all those soldiers die because George didn't save them. And Mary ends up unmarried and unhappy, and without a friend who doesn't see her as a sex object, Violet turns to more seedier activities. And everyone lives in slums owned by Mr. Potter, because George isn't around to build them houses or to finance those houses. And what George is able to see is how important he really was to so many people. Clarence tells him each man's life touches so many others' lives, and when he isn't around, he leaves an awful hole, doesn't he? What George's despair at the bridge and in this moment represents is the dark night of the soul, our dark night of the soul. Because most, if not all of us, have probably thought at least once in our lives, maybe things would be better if I just wasn't around. That the problems we have just seem too big to overcome, maybe even impossible to solve. Perhaps we've done like George and gone to prayer, show me the way, God. Show me, just give me a sign that you were there. And we felt like our prayers weren't answered, or even worse, in a drunken state, George gets into a fight with a man down the bar and gets punched in the face. He said, well, there's God's answer to me. So not only do we think God's not there for us, but God is actually working against us in our moments of despair. And yet, if you notice in the bar scene, Martini, the owner of the bar, is trying to get him to stop. Why don't you go home? I'll get you a ride. The other people, come on, George. You know, people love you. Why don't you go home to Mary? It's okay. It's all going to work out. But he doesn't see any of that happening. The darkness is just so overwhelming on him. All he can focus is on the negatives. So he doesn't see the ways that God is trying to show him the way. In a story in the New Yorker, Ted Friend wrote about people who had survived jumping off of the Golden Gate Bridge. And the 26 people he interviewed, all of them told him that the minute they left the bridge, they said, this is a mistake. One of them said, instantly he saw his hand leave the rail, the last thing to go over, and he immediately thought, what in the hell did I just do? And he said everything that he thought in his life that was unsolvable, that was overwhelming, instantly was solvable. Except for the fact now he was falling down into the Bay of San Francisco. And so I'm not trying to downplay the darkness that surrounds people in the dark night of the soul that leads to these sorts of acts. And if you are experiencing that in your moment in your life now or sometime in the future, know that help is available, that you are not alone. And that God does answer those prayers for direction. God says that taking your life is not part of God's plan. It's not God's ways, and that God walks with us even through the valley of the shadow of death. That we are never alone, that the hope of God is there. The light of Christ is there, shining in the darkest moments of our lives. We just have to look for it. And the rest of us have to be that light for those who are in need. Because it turns out that Clarence doesn't solve George's problems. All he does is change George's perspective on his life. He says that thing that you think is just so big isn't really that big at all. And so that leads us back to angels. In Scripture, angels don't have wings. Instead, they look like humans. They look like us. While cherubim and seraphim, who are heavenly forms of some sort, have wings, and one of them hang from the ceiling and one come up from the floor. I can never remember which one of them does which. But it's not clear that cherubim and seraphim are angels. Instead, when angels appear, think about the story of Abraham or Sarah or Lot. They appear in human form. In Hebrews, we hear, the author tells us, welcome strangers. Why? Because in doing so, some people have entertained angels. So unlike Clarence, who's trying to win his wings, when he gets his wings, he won't look human anymore. He won't be able to do the work for George that he does. So what do you think that means for us? That angels look like humans. It means that we can look like angels. The Greek word for angel simply means messenger. It comes from a longer Greek word, euangelion. We've talked about this in the past, where we get the Greek word for angel. It's also where we get evangelist. It is the word for good news. The good news of Jesus Christ. When you become evangelist, you are an angel, a messenger of God, delivering good news to the world. In Paul's letter to the Galatians, he says that we are to carry one another's burdens. Or as Jesus says in the passage we heard today, in order to be great, you must be a slave to all. You must be an angel, serving others, bringing the light of Christ, bringing the good news, crying out the way. And so after seeing what the world would be like without him there, George asks God, let me live again. And he comes back and he finds out how many angels he has in his life. That you sing. There's nothing there? What do you mean there's nothing there?
It's just an inside.
Okay. Well, it was there earlier, so. But you all know the scene. Anybody here never seen It's a Wonderful Life? All right, one person. I'll leave it to you, Rick. You can watch it.
Thank you.
So George comes running back. He's wishing everybody Merry Christmas to everybody in town. And he goes into the house, and Mary comes in. And she has a big basket full of money, and then the house gets filled up with people who are giving money because George has changed their lives, and so this is their opportunity to give back. And one of their friends wires from London that he's giving a line of credit for $25,000. And the bank examiner pulls money out of his own wallet and puts it in, and the sheriff tears up the arrest warrant that George has. And then they begin singing what song? Hark the Herald Angels Sing. Same song we began this series with. It's almost like these are tied together or something. But everything is right with the world, and Harry then shows up and he gives a toast to George, and he says, to the richest man in town. And it's not because George has the most money, but because he's changed so many lives. who carry burdens, so I'd say. On the radio station Caleb, they once asked, and I'm stealing this from Reverend Dan Boyd, if God answered the prayers the way you prayed them, would anyone's life be changed? If God answered the prayers the way you prayed them, would anybody's life be changed? And I'm not talking about the promise that if you win the lottery, you'll give a lot of it away. That's not what we're talking about here. And the same question could be asked about the life we live. Because we influence people whether we know it or not. We influence people even if we don't know them by making a difference or not making a difference in somebody else's life. Because Potter makes an impact on people's lives. It's just, he doesn't do it in a positive way. And he may have the most money. He may have the most power, but he is not the richest man in town. George is. Because George changes lives. George builds community. He builds houses. That dream he had of building things has come true. He just never saw it that way. And so in the scene of the run on the bank, there's a quote hanging on the wall from George's father. It says, "All you can take with you is that which you've given away." All that you can take with you is that which you've given away. And George gives of himself. Even though he hasn't been paying attention, he's built things. He's built community. He's built neighborhoods. He's built his town. Quietly, he's been doing that thing that he dreamed about doing his whole life. He just never saw himself doing it. He was an angel to everyone else in town when they were in need. And then in turn, they became his angels. And now the task falls to us. So we began talking about living every day like it's Christmas, which means living in joy and living fearlessly. And we are called then to also live as angels, those who proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ. Not just by the words we say, but by how we live our lives, the things that we do. So may we go out and live our lives so that people will say, that is the richest person. We are the richest church in town. I pray that it will be so, my brothers and sisters.